communities. Commercial fishing has been an important thing in Washington, the Columbia Basin, since about the mid 1800s. But of course, we can't talk about salmon and fishing without acknowledging indigenous peoples. And I'm just going to read something I took from one of our local tribes' websites. Since time immemorial, indigenous people in the Columbia Basin sustained a way of life dependent on a healthy ecosystem. Salmon were and continue to be critical to the ecosystem and the physical and spiritual health of Northwest Indian tribes. Natives drew fish from the Columbia at several major sites, which also served as trading posts. Celilo Falls, located east of the Dalles, was a vital hub for trade and the interaction with different cultural groups, being used for fishing and trading for 11,000 years. This is a theme that I try to reiterate throughout this. I don't want to butcher indigenous people history or culture, so I also want to be sensitive, but fishing to indigenous peoples was a way of life. And of course, you have sport fishers. If you have lived in the Northwest for any amount of time, there's a good chance that you've been salmon fishing or caught a salmon, or somebody in your family fishes for salmon. It is quite a draw. It is also an economic driver for a lot of small communities. I think about the fishing industry, all the tackle and lures and boats and fuel and all the things that come along with it. Even as our salmon decline, our state tries to provide fishing opportunities, and it is quite challenged by the endangered species and some very weak stocks. But salmon fishing in the Northwest, it's a part of our recent heritage. And this slide was titled lunatics before, but I thought enthusiast was maybe more appropriate. There's people that really love salmon so much that they tattoo pictures of salmon on their body. And yeah, I'll just leave it at that. But if we love salmon so much in the Northwest and care about them, why are they in dire straits? And the goal of tonight's presentation is to give you some of the backstory to that. I've really enjoyed digging around and finding resources that document this decline. There are other books that have done that too, as I pointed out earlier, but I certainly don't know the complete story. I'm not going to pretend to be an expert, but I'm going to try to give you a pretty good overview. So we're going to start with the Columbia River system, because that's what we're talking about tonight from a physical standpoint, the setting of tonight's talk. The Columbia River is the fourth largest river in North America by volume. It's 1,200 miles long, and it's got another 10,000 miles of tributaries, some of the longest being the Snake, Kootenai, Deschutes. I also put the Wenatchee River and Methow in there just for kind of a reference point for you. The headwaters of the Columbia are in British Columbia, and it's over 259,000 square miles, which is about roughly the size of Texas. The Columbia Basin is incredibly diverse in terms of topography and climate and hydrology. And the reason I want you to know this is because it emphasizes how salmon have adapted to these different climates, and also to think about the Columbia River system, as vast as it is, all being connected. And every stream, every tributary is important at different times of the year and different years. You know, we have different climates throughout this huge area. We have glacier-fed streams, snow-dominant streams, we have high desert, you know, we have all these different niches within the Columbia Basin. And salmon have evolved to adapt to these different niches and different hydrographs when the rainfall comes down the river, when the snow melts. They've adapted to the different temperature regimes. and they've adapted their bodies to swim into some of these unique places, some of them being quite steep cascades or waterfalls. Looking really big picture, the Northwest has a really interesting geological history. And salmon have been around for millions of years, actually, in some form or another. But in the Northwest, in Washington, and I know a lot of the listeners tonight probably are familiar with the basalt floods that repeatedly kind of burped out lava and spilled across our state. You can see that driving just east of the Columbia River into Grant County, and also the Missoula floods. But this landscape was formed, it was pretty violent between volcanic activity and plate tectonics. We went through multiple iterations of severe climate change, including a lot of glaciations where glaciers were coming down into Washington state and then receding and carving valleys on their way out. But salmon evolved through this. Salmon have evolved through a lot of different climates and a lot of landform changes and have managed to hang on through some pretty catastrophic events. Here's just a geologic map of those basalt flows. And one thing I think you'll see over and over in this presentation is sort of the general overlay of the geology and the Missoula floods and salmon habitat, and they're all overlaid on one another. Again, I'm sure everybody on this call probably knows about the Missoula floods, but they were repeated dam break floods from Lake Missoula, and they would send walls of water hundreds of feet deep across our state, carving channels and carving coulees, and really created the Columbia River drainage. This is evidenced nowadays in modern times by Dry Falls State Park, Moses Coulee, Grand Coulee. You can also see glacial erratics out in the basin, which are large boulders that were carried down on ice sheets. And now we're going to turn for a few minutes and talk about salmon themselves and the species. There are chum salmon in the lower Columbia, but not up here. We primarily have Chinook, coho, and steelhead and sockeye. Coho were extirpated in our region from logging practices. The Yakima Nation has had a pretty successful reintroduction program. Chinook salmon, or king, these are the largest bodied salmon. These have typically been sort of the hallmark of the salmon species. They're semelparous, so they die after they spawn. They live from 1 to 8 years in the saltwater. I'd say most commonly 2 to 3 years. And like I said, they're a prized sport fish. They're the biggest body, longest lived, and have probably been hit hardest overall from early industrialized fishing. That was the primary target species. The picture on the right are what are known as June hogs. And these salmon, they're Chinook salmon, came into the river in June. So we have spring, summer, and fall runs of Chinook. And these salmon were massive. And you don't see salmon like this anymore for a variety of reasons. But it really piques my interest to see fish like this. I'm always telling myself either those men in the picture are tiny or those salmon have been photoshopped. But it's not true. Those really did exist in the Columbia River system. And they spawn pretty far inland. As I mentioned, coho salmon, they live throughout the Columbia Basin. They were extirpated in Upper Columbia, where we are now. And the Yakima Nation has had a pretty successful reintroduction program. When you see an adult coho and adult Chinook laying next to each other, they look almost identical. A few subtle a few subtle differences, but they were also commercially harvested and are popular sport fish. They tend to live in the freshwater for a couple of years before they migrate out to sea. Where Chinook have a stream type, where they rear in the freshwater for a year, and an ocean type, where they migrate out within their first year of life. Sockeye salmon, while they can have large runs, you think about sometimes Lake Wenatchee or Lake Osoyoos in Canada. Sometimes the runs are quite large, but there are not a lot of stocks of sockeye salmon in the Columbia River Basin, only 4 or 5. Steelhead are part of the salmonid family, but they're actually a trout. They have incredibly diverse life histories. They are the same species as rainbow trout. So a rainbow trout does not leave the saltwater, a steelhead does. They are our Washington state fish, and they can repeat spawn, which is one of the really unique things about steelhead. Also an incredibly prized fish, often called the fish of 1,000 casts. So I'm gonna whip through a few other native fish and non-native fish here. I'm not gonna go into depth, but I wanted to just have an honorable mention. West Slope cutthroat, Pacific lamprey. They've also been a culturally significant species for indigenous people. Bull trout, I forgot to mention, spring Chinook salmon in our region are endangered. Bull trout and steelhead are threatened under the Endangered Species Act. Pike minnow. They thrive in what are now reservoirs along the Columbia River, and there's actually a bounty on them because they do eat young salmon, but they are a native species, as are mountain whitefish. Don't know much about green sturgeon or white sturgeon, but they are also native fish. And then we have a series of non-native fish. I'm just going to talk about a few of the better known non-native fish. Walleye, popular sport fish, delicious to eat, but a threat to salmon. Northern pike. Currently, northern pike are in the upper portion of the US Columbia River, also known as Lake Roosevelt, and they are a looming threat for salmon if they make their way downstream from Lake Roosevelt and Rufus Woods. This will be a problem. And largemouth bass can be found in the Columbia River as well. So I mentioned this a little bit earlier, but salmon have been around for a long, long time. There's fossils of salmon. I'll pull this reference up here really quickly because I just learned about this and it kind of blew me away. But some of the oldest fossilized salmon are from the Eocene 49 million years ago. And there's been fossils found in Republic, Washington. And that's what the picture is at the bottom of your screen. It's a 17-inch fossil. They've also found fossils in the Skokomish Valley and Puget Sound. Archaeologists have found the evidence of large, 400-pound saber-toothed salmon. They had big teeth that developed when they came into the rivers to spawn. But salmon have been around for a long, long time and have adapted through that chaotic environment that I mentioned before. In the Columbia Basin, it's thought that they occupied almost 13,000 miles of rivers and streams. And the Columbia is estimated to have produced between 10 and 16 million salmon annually, or 10 to 16 million salmon annually would return to the river. And I've seen estimates higher too, from 20 to 30 million. Our record keeping pre-European influence is not great. And so these estimates were deduced from early cannery operations. So this is the halftime. I guess we've been going for about 20 minutes, so I'm going pretty fast, but if you want to refill your beverage or use the bathroom, Ash could put some questions out and we could have a little discussion for a minute, but I wanted to break up this presentation because I felt like it was pretty long to just go and not stop.
Yeah, so use this as an opportunity to use the Q&A feature in this Zoom or in the chat if you have questions. And guys, we'll just give you a few minutes to get settled back in.
Well, maybe we should carry on. It's hard to tell what people are doing with everyone's cameras off. Of course, I'm kind of just speaking into the computer, but
I have one hand raised, so
oh, cool.
What their question is. Yeah, go ahead. Or there's a Q&A now. Okay, let's see. It says, did the June hogs come all the way up the Wenatchee?
I don't know that they came up the Wenatchee. Take my answer with a grain of salt, but I believe they traveled pretty far up the main stem Columbia River. And that large body allowed them to ascend, pretty good sized cascades. And also they would be spawning in really large substrate. If you think about, if you've ever seen a video or seen a salmon spawning, generally the larger body salmon are spawning in deeper water, faster current with larger substrate. So I'm pretty sure those June hogs were upriver fish. I'm not 100%.
Awesome. And then it looks like we have one person who's waiting to, do salmon and trout share habitat?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. Salmon and trout definitely overlap. Bull trout, rainbow trout, and cutthroat trout overlap with salmon. And I think there's some codependency too. If you think about large salmon coming back from the ocean, they're delivering a lot of nutrients. They have thousands of eggs, which are just like little power bars. And so absolutely, they absolutely overlap juveniles and adults. Good questions. Move on, Ash.
Yeah, it looks like that's it for now. And we'll have an opportunity at the end to
Okay.
additional questions.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. So yeah, humans have inhabited the Columbia Basin for over 12,000 years before the last ice age. There are seasonal and permanent indigenous camps up and down the Columbia River. Places like Celilo and Kettle Falls were of particular importance. Then fast forwarding quite a bit, it's a pretty big jump in my timeline, but this handsome fellow, Robert Gray, was the first American to discover the Columbia River. We think he was the first European to discover the Columbia River, named it after his ship. And so he planted a flag and put some tokens under a tree on the banks of the Columbia River in 1792. And from there, things really changed dramatically in a relatively short time scale compared to some of the other contexts that we've been talking about. Lewis and Clark arrived 13 years later, arrived in 1805, followed by other explorers and fur traders. And the state really saw rapid growth in the 1840s. And we became a state in 1889. And I'm just always amazed how quickly this region has transformed. It really hasn't been that long. I don't want to talk much about this slide because I don't want to take any thunder away, but Trout Unlimited will be talking about beavers and their important role that they play in salmon habitat creation. But yeah, they were pretty much hunted to extinction by around 1900. The fur trading industry was one of our first sort of natural resource exploits as non-native people moved in. I haven't found a whole lot of research about mining in our region in the Columbia, but I do know places like the Shaston Creek, tributary to the Wenatchee River, had a mining camp, the town of Blewett. And I do know that mining on this scale really did transform the landscape. And the habitat things that we're going to talk about, including beavers, I just want you to walk away knowing that while these happened a long time ago, 150, 200 years ago, we think of the effects as these legacy impacts. And they're legacy impacts because we don't see them happening now, but they have transformed our creeks and rivers. And so while we don't see people mining and we don't even see that much logging that much anymore, especially stream side, these effects last generations and generations. Logging, along with industrialized salmon fishing and mining, were common themes when it came to new camps and settlements and towns and railroads. Humans flocked to where there was labor and jobs and money. And that really was the foundation of a lot of the towns throughout at least the western side of the Columbia River in the Cascade foothills like Leavenworth and so on. And the picture in the middle, a couple of these pictures I got off the University of Washington website, and I'm quite certain they're Western Washington logging pictures, but you can see Leavenworth down here in the lower left. The upper right is actually a log drive on the Wenatchee River. And then this dam this was a mill dam at the mouth of the Eniac River. And these practices, I can't stress to you how much they changed our rivers. I won't say permanently, but for the long term. Building splash dams to transport wood to the mills and these log drives, they cleared every obstruction. We really used our rivers as highways, basically. Agriculture was pretty prolific as well. And I don't know how expansive it was in the early 19th century, but I do know from what I found, the way that we used to irrigate our tree fruit and other ag fields was through unscreened diversions. And a reference I read was, in the early 1900s, there were observations of fields shimmering silver from all the dead salmon smolts. So, just another kind of, just kind of another harm to salmon in the process of developing our landscapes and moving in. And then early industrialized commercial fishing in the Lower Columbia. Now this was absolutely probably the single biggest impact to our salmon populations in the Columbia River. The first cannery was built in 1866 in the Lower Columbia and operated for about 80 years. At the height, there were 40 to 50 canneries. That's I don't know if I can convey this, but between the fish wheels that were built in the river and the beach seines that were used and the little steamers, this operation was cleaning house. And I think when Europeans first moved to the region, every resource must have seemed inexhaustible, from salmon to trees to beavers. And in pretty short order, the businesses and the government realized, no, actually, we're harming these fish, and they're watching these runs of salmon become depleted in pretty short time. This is kind of a fun graphic that illustrates that. This is looking back to, about the time the first cannery came online. There was 40 million pounds harvested, on average. And a former staff that we had made that comparison to 2 Eiffel Towers, 20 statues of Liberty, and 1,000 Subaru Foresters. I bet you there's a few Subaru Forester drivers on this call right now, but just an unimaginable amount of salmon were being pulled from the river. So much so sometimes that they couldn't even keep up with processing. And they'd have to discard them, or they were trying to harvest Chinook salmon and they'd get steelhead or coho or whatever and just discard it. And the picture on the right, a lot of you may not have ever seen, but it's a fish wheel. Basically, they set these things up in the river in narrow constrictions, and it's like it would just scoop salmon up, and there just wasn't much discrimination or anything given to the resource. And no surprise to us now looking back, but we knew a long time ago that salmon were in trouble. Within 100 years of European settlement, we had depleted a resource that had been here for thousands of years. So 100 years, we had depleted this resource severely. And I would argue that salmon never overcame this. But this was kind of the beginning of me putting together this presentation a couple of years ago, is really looking through these old documents. That's one of the really fun things about our jobs. We do salmon habitat restoration work, and we're always trying to put back the pieces to how these watersheds and how these streams used to look, and trying to understand the impacts that have taken place and why they look like they do today. We love looking at old maps, and some of these old publications are extremely interesting, but here's, clear documentation that they were in trouble. There's fewer salmon at these locations where salmon were always abundant. And I also thought this fourth line down was pretty interesting too. Artificial propagation should be invoked as an aid, not as a substitute for reproduction under natural conditions. So the industrialized salmon revolution really took off with the advent of canning salmon. I meant to say this a couple of slides ago, but once we learned how to can and preserve salmon, we were shipping Columbia River salmon all around the world, and people got a taste of it. But obviously this practice was not sustainable and did irreparable harm. And then came kind of the next level of development in the Columbia Basin. 100 dams in the first 30 years of the 20th century. And these are tributary dams. So these would be dams, probably smaller dams for irrigation, probably some mill dams for logging. And then by the 30s, the Columbia River Federal Power System became a thing. And we started building hydropower dams on the Columbia, Rock Island being the oldest, followed by Bonneville, followed by several others. Talk about Grand Coulee here in a second. So here's a small 100-year-old dam on the Wenatchee River, the Tumwater Dam. This was used to power the Great Northern Railroad through the Cascade Tunnel. That dam is still there. It does have a fish ladder, but just an interesting part of our history. And Grand Coulee Dam, this is a spectacle for sure. At the time, I think people said it was the largest human-made feature in the world. And if you want a great documentary, the PBS has The Biggest Thing on Earth. It's a story about the Grand Coulee Dam, and I think you would all love it. It talks a lot about the development of our region and the saga of the Grand Coulee Dam. But the Grand Coulee Dam was a wartime and Depression era dam. It was a project to put people to work and to irrigate a dry landscape of Eastern Washington and make it fruitful for people. It also blocked 1,200 miles of salmon habitat, and it still does to this day. I think because of where our country was at this time, there wasn't a loud outcry about the blocked salmon habitat. And the federal government came up with a mitigation program, and that's the Grand Coulee Fish Maintenance Project. And the thought was, well, we can't build fish ladders over Grand Coulee. It's too tall, it's too big, it'll cost too much money. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna capture all the returning salmon at Rock Island Dam, and we're gonna put them in the tributaries like the Wenatchee and the Eniat. And we're just gonna relocate these fish, basically. So this study that I have shown here was a kind of a look back on the success of that program. And I think at the time that Grand Coulee Fish Maintenance Project was thought to be a success, but there were clearly problems. But definitely there were concerns raised. But again, our country had different priorities at that time. I mentioned Silo Falls earlier. I never want to be conveyed as anti-dam or anti-hydropower. I'm sensitive to that living here. Hydropower is keeping my laptop on right now and the lights on in this workspace. It's pretty green energy, and so I'm grateful for it. I'm an owner of our hydropower locally, so I don't want to be anti-dam. I just want us to understand that dams transform the landscape for indigenous people and for salmon, and so it came at a cost, I think is what I'll just leave it at that. There are 14 main stem Columbia River dams and 450 approximately throughout the basin. I'm going to show you, it's kind of a slow video here in a second. Hopefully it doesn't throw our whole program off, but it's a 3-minute video. And I think it's a cool depiction. If you keep an eye on the yellow, that's the naturally historic areas where salmon migrated to. And then you're going to see blobs of red happen over time. You see the timeline is 1891. So this is a recreation of dams blocking fish in the Columbia River system. So I'm going to try to play this. I hope I don't do anything to mess this presentation up, but let's see. So bear with me, just 3 minutes, quiet time. And I can't get away from the ad, so. Okay, so just watch the year in the upper right-hand corner, and then watch how the yellow turns to red.
You may have the not the video screen highlighted right now.
Oh no.
That's still just your presentation.
Okay. How do I do that? All right. I knew I shouldn't have gotten tricky like that. I think I'm going to skip it. If you want to write down this website, you can watch it on your own. It's 3 minutes long. I don't want to jeopardize. I don't know if I should. Yeah, we'll skip it. The short story is that a lot of dams sprouted up throughout the Snake River and Columbia Basin that blocked habitat. And then as the 1990s and 2000s came around, you had little dams coming out or reintroduction programs, trap and haul programs that started allowing salmon back to some of their native habitat. So this is just, again, I just want to make a point here about dams. They are important for a lot of reasons. Grand Coulee is kind of in a class of its own, and Chief Joe is later built downstream of Grand Coulee, but those block a tremendous amount of habitat. But what I want to talk about just for a second, I'm not an expert in this, but when we look at survival, salmon survival through these dams, you see those percentages. And if I'm going to get a grade in school and it's 95 or 98%, I'm pretty happy about that. So my point is, these dams have pretty high survival rates, and that's excellent. But we have to think collectively, because no anadromous salmon, well, unless they're just going above Bonneville, but our salmon are going through many, many dams. And so I just want people to think about the cumulative effect of going through, downstream of the Wenatchee is, I think, 7 main stem dams. So there's a cumulative effect of hydropower projects. And I think that's something that's difficult for us to wrap our head around and manage. But individually, the dams, they have very high survival, and there have been so many modifications to improve, especially downstream passage and survival. Hatcheries have been pretty integral in the Columbia River since the cannery started. Really, the hatchery program was supposed to be the answer to the canneries seeing these fish numbers dwindle. And we continue, 150 years later to rely on hatcheries. And hatcheries are, they can be a hot topic for people. People feel very strongly against them or for them. I find myself being somewhere in the middle. We need them. We need them to provide salmon for indigenous peoples to harvest through treaties. We need them to support sport and commercial fishing. And then we also need them because some salmon stocks are so low that some of these hatcheries are strictly just there to keep those individual unique stocks around and preventing extinction. So we're in a really difficult situation with hatcheries because they also have been documented to have impacts on wild fish. And so there's an ongoing debate about the role of hatcheries. Some people think we have way too many hatchery fish in the system. Other people think we don't have enough. I certainly don't have the answer. I am a sport fisherman. I hope I get to salmon fish until my last day. But it has to be recognized that there are downsides too. Yeah, so here's a couple of historic photos. The Bucket Brigade pouring salmon smolts in the upper Columbia on the left. I think this hatchery on the right is one of the lower Columbia federal hatcheries. Yeah, and then fast forwarding a little bit, early salmon conservation efforts, while well-intended, were a bit misguided. If I had my job in the 50s, I probably would have been out pulling logs out of the stream so that salmon could get upriver. And, so I think the early restoration actions were actually a little bit hurtful, but their heart was in the right place. They were trying to do what they could, but a theme is definitely a reliance on hatcheries. Hatcheries as a backstop. You can see some of these principles in that early Department of Fisheries book that I just showed, removing stream obstructions like log jams, and constructing fishways around cascades and things, screening irrigation ditches. Yeah, of course we should do that, and we do. Saving water for in-stream flows, preventing pollution, and regulating culverts. But we've known for quite a long time what to do. And I think we've been really working at the habitat angle for a while. In the 90s, it was quite a turning point when it comes to Endangered Species Act coming to Washington. This is Lonesome Larry. He was the lone sockeye to return to Redfish Lake in Idaho. And this really rang the alarm bells, and federal government got involved. And so Snake River sockeye were the first listed salmon in Washington state, followed by several other listings. I have a map here. So like I mentioned earlier, in our region, we have endangered spring Chinook salmon, threatened steelhead, and threatened bull trout, and their listings throughout the Columbia River Basin. Some are more dire than others. And I'd say the government has been pretty committed to funding salmon recovery efforts through means of conservation hatcheries and habitat, fishing regulations and things like that. Is it enough? You know, time will tell, but we're seeing our salmon populations are still really struggling. There's not a whole lot of bright spots in the Columbia River. There's a few, but the Endangered Species Act was thought to be pretty heavy-handed. It affected a lot of people and how we managed our water and habitat. One thing I've always caught, I read, you know, pretty much every article about salmon when I see it in the newspaper or online. And one thing that gets me a little bit fired up is when you see, you know, record returns of such and such. And so for this group, one thing I just want you to realize is to have the long view in mind. So you could see a chart, like you could see a graph like this and see like 2001 was a record year, you know, and that's exciting, that's encouraging. But remember what we learned tonight about when salmon were really depleted. We're talking like 1900. So this is the concept in ecological restoration of the shifting baseline. By 1938, you know, that's when we could start counting fish at Rock Island Dam. We had a pretty good idea, but before that, we didn't really have good counts. We know there were a lot more salmon certainly before 1938, but the shifting baseline applies to a lot of things. And in our field of habitat restoration, you know, we often look at a river and we even talk to people much older than us, can look at historic photos and people are like, well, that river has always looked that way. Well, it probably hasn't. It's probably been manipulated, you know, generations ago. I know my kids, when they look, and myself, when we look at the Columbia River down in Wenatchee, like that's the way it's always looked for us, but that's not actually how it used to be. And when we're looking at data like this, I want everybody to know that the baseline has shifted. And when we look at endangered species and how we get to recovery, you know, we're supposed to hit 4,500 wild spring Chinook to the upper Columbia. You can see it's kind of a depressing outlook. And I don't want to leave you feeling doom and gloom, but I want you to know like things are desperate. And hopefully by conveying that to you, hopefully that motivates you to learn more and get involved. I just thought this was interesting. You know, we mentioned earlier 10 to 16 million salmon returning to the Columbia historically. That's the best account that we have. And our 10-year average up to 2015 was about 2.3 million, just to give you an idea of how small of runs we're talking about. So now I've been told when I've given this presentation in the past that it's a downer. And I don't know how to get around that totally, but what I'm going to try to do is talk about a few bright spots since the Salmon Recovery Act was passed. And I think there's, you know, bipartisan support to support the recovery of salmon. And I think most citizens want that too. We have different ideas about how to get there, but I'd say that our hatcheries have come a long way in terms of how they operate and are managed to lessen their impacts on wild fish. There's an army of people doing habitat protection and restoration. We've gotten most of the irrigation projects online to where they're not in training and killing salmon. We've implemented a lot of water irrigation. When I say we, I just say collectively, but you know, we've tried to minimize impacts from irrigation. The hydro system is almost as finely tuned as it can be when it comes to salmon survival. Well, maybe with the exception of Grand Coulee and Chief Joseph Dam and some of the Snake River dams, but locally, our hydro projects are doing what they can within their confines to keep salmon into the future. Predator control is a big issue you probably hear about, from pinnipeds in the lower Columbia taking advantage of fish ladders to bird predation, non-native fish predation, and also native fish predation like pike minnow who thrive in these reservoirs. But fishing regulations are constantly evolving, political hot button issue, and reintroduction into the upper Columbia above Grand Coulee Dam. A couple things that keep me going. I received this from a friend who's a biologist. NOAA does these ocean productivity and temperature rating charts, and we've been in a pretty bad place the last decade. And actually 2021 is looking like better ocean conditions, which means higher survival and should be higher returns. So that's great. Hopefully we're entering a cycle of colder Pacific Ocean and more upwelling, more marine, more nutrient-rich waters off the coast. There's some interesting work being done to find alternatives to gill netting in the lower Columbia that would lessen impacts to fish. These I think they're called pound nets, but they can trap salmon and sort them and release wild fish with a much higher survival than, say, a gill net. Reintroduction is a great big topic. We gave a series of talks, I think 2019, with Upper Columbia United Tribes and the Colville tribes. This reintroduction program has several phases. It's pretty complex, but there's a treaty with Canada that the US is renegotiating with, and the tribes have a seat at the table. And I encourage you to learn more about reintroduction. It's pretty exciting. There have been ceremonial releases above Grand Coulee, and I think the tribes are getting some really important data about where those fish are going and how they're doing. I do think that removing derelict dams that are not providing a public benefit anymore, I think that's really exciting as well. Here's a couple examples from the Columbia River Basin. These are, generally these rivers are quickly accessed by fish returning. I think these are win-wins. And I think we'll see more of them because the era of dam building was a long time ago. And these all have a certain useful life. The Wild Salmon Center out of Portland is looking really big picture across the Pacific Rim. I showed a picture of the book Stronghold by Guido Rohr earlier. I encourage you to look into this work. They basically prioritized watersheds around the Pacific Rim where salmon are still thriving. And so, thinking really big picture, thinking global about salmon, how we protect them so that they have a future. And I think this is my last slide, but this was in a bunch of different newspapers earlier. This is like the biggest research project in the North Pacific to learn about salmon survival in the North Pacific. This has been a big black box for salmon managers. And so this is multiple nations coming together with their research vessels and doing a big intensive study of the North Pacific. And then there's us. My organization is one of 14 regional fisheries enhancement groups. We were created by the legislature in the 90s to address dwindling salmon runs on a very local level. In fact, the word enhancement in our title really comes from our bread and butter was doing like basically mini hatcheries in people's backyard or egg boxes. But science and policy has changed, and now these groups are very active in salmon habitat restoration. And we work voluntarily with landowners. It's very rewarding, it's very challenging, but our organization, and just in the Columbia Basin alone, there are so many, tribal, state, local government, conservation districts, land trusts, Trout Unlimited. There's so many people out there trying to carve out a living for salmon and, try to improve that habitat and turn it back to a relic of what it once was. I think for our fish to survive into the future, they've got to be connected to these cold water tributaries and have good habitat. And so that's one of the things that we focus on. We're restoring native fish habitat through enhancement, education, and community engagement, like tonight's talk. And then lastly, this would be incomplete if I didn't ask you to step up, but I'm going to give you some suggestions to volunteer on a restoration project, volunteer on a nonprofit board working on this, donate money to Salmon Recovery and get your network to do the same thing. Do legislative outreach, read up on the bills that are being considered in Olympia. You can call in so easily now and testify on a bill that is pro-salmon. Restore your property. This one I struggle with a little bit. I've got a family of 5, but lessen your impact. Use less water, turn off the lights, try to carpool or whatever you can to use less fossil fuel. Educate yourself and educate others. And you've survived. So I really appreciate this. I hope you feel like this was a good use of your time. I'm gonna take a drink of water and pause and see if there's any questions.
Yeah, we had a couple questions come in. I think you touched on all of these just a little bit. But one of them is, why have we not been able to fish the Wenatchee River or the tributaries?
These are really good questions for the Department of Fish and Wildlife, but I will try. You can fish the Wenatchee when there is expected to be a surplus run of hatchery Chinook or hatchery coho. When the hatcheries think that they're going to get the number of eggs, they'll open it up to sport fishing. I miss the steelhead season. I really do. That was my favorite fishery on the Wenatchee, and steelhead numbers are in the toilet. So it's really about conservation. A lot of the Wenatchee tributaries are closed because we have multiple listed species. We have bull trout, steelhead, and spring Chinook. And I think, well, I know the department has to get permission from the federal government, from NOAA or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, to open up a fishery. And in order to do that, they have to prove that there's not going to be impacts to listed fish. And so I know the department gets a bad rap, but it's very difficult to open fisheries in waters where ESA fish are listed. I hope that helps. I think you could call a biologist at Department of Fish and Wildlife and probably get a more complete answer, but that's my take.
Well, and then we had another one, I think you touched on this a little bit after, is what is the population trends happening kind of in our rivers right now?
Yeah, I should have pulled some graphs, but I will direct you, if you go to UCSRB, that's the Upper Columbia Salmon Recovery Board.org. They have a new annual report, and it's actually really interesting because it talks about hatcheries, hydropower, habitat, and harvest, and they have more current numbers. In general, they're not good for our listed fish. What's interesting is sometimes our summer Chinook runs can be pretty robust, and sometimes the coho runs, that the Yakima Nation is their reintroduction program. Sometimes those come back in pretty good numbers. Of course, sockeye, if anybody tracks that, we have a Lake Wenatchee sockeye run every so often. If they get over, I don't know if it's 14,000 fish over Tumwater Dam, they open that up. So some stocks really fluctuate, but the lowest common denominator is going to be spring Chinook and steelhead, and they're very low. And that's a big driver of recreational fishing. So.
And then another question is, what is the projection for climate change effects on salmon?
That's a great question. That question, so in our grants that we write for our habitat restoration work, we have to answer a question like that, specific to tributaries. And there's been some really interesting work done by the UW and Department of Ecology. There's maps you can look at projected stream temperatures by tributary. So climate change is real and it is having a real effect. I think I can say with confidence that some of our main stem rivers are going to continue to push that threshold for cold water fish, such as salmon. And so I think our fish are going to become more and more reliant on cold water refuge, which we have in our basins in the eastern slopes of the Cascades. And so making sure that those are connected and functioning well. But that is a huge underlying threat to fish, given all these other things, all these other stressors. It's it's death by 1,000 cuts. But climate change is a big one for sure.
Another question is, we've talked a little bit or a lot about tributaries, but what were salmon spawn numbers within the main stem of Columbia?
That's a great question. Again, I don't know. I don't have data on that, but I do know that, the Hanford Reach, we still have Chinook spawning in the Hanford Reach. The department has videoed Chinook spawning below Chief Joseph Dam. So I'm winging it, everybody. So be patient, take what I say with a grain of salt. Salmon used to spawn in the main stem Columbia. I don't think we had any kind of quantitative observations or enumerations of that. But of course, when the free-flowing river turns into a reservoir, there's silt and sediment, and that spawning substrate is covered. So I don't know how important it was, but it certainly was a factor.
This is a fun one. What was the name of the PBS documentary that you mentioned?
The Biggest Thing on Earth. It's awesome. I love it. Highly recommend it. You'll hear all about Rufus Woods Sr. and the Wenatchee world and how they were promoting the Grand Coulee Dam. It's a really fun documentary.
And then we have a question. How do we get the environmental impact statements to actually investigate the overbuilding of STRs, apartments, condos with runoff from their blacktop?
Who's that from? Just kidding. No. Yeah, local land use regulations are a tough one. I'm not going to dive too far into that. I think when it comes to local planning, the Growth Management Act, it's really complicated. You could imagine being in Olympia passing laws that affect development in Chelan County and being on that hot seat. But we certainly have work to do because we are still harming habitat, both, in Puget Sound and along our waterways. So I don't have a good answer. I'm sorry.
I feel like this one is a pretty good one, maybe to end on question wise. But we're also happy to take questions by email later on, or if you have something that pops up, put it in the chat now. But this one is, what are some active projects that are accepting volunteers in our area right now?
Great question. Can you put my email up, Ash, or?
Yeah, we can throw that up. Jen,
yeah, volunteering is super important. You can do the one-off thing. We tend to plant trees in the fall, or you could take on a longer program where you're dedicated to going out to a stream every once in a while, regularly. So it just depends on what your time schedule and commitment looks like. But we'd like to find a place for you if you're interested.
Awesome. Well, it looks like Jason's email is in the chat if you do have further questions. But I would really like to thank you, Jason, for your time tonight and your passion for work.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm still a student of all of these things. So I just think it's the things I've learned, I wanted to convey to others and hopefully get people excited and don't hang your head down. We got work to do. But thanks everybody for taking your time tonight. I really appreciate it. Thanks, Ash, and thanks, Jen.
Absolutely. And make sure to check out the Cascade Fisheries website for more information as well. And then join us next month for the second presentation in this series. It's called Salmon Grow on Trees, the Role of Forest Management in the Life Cycle of Salmon. And that will be with Ryan Williams from Cascadia Conservation District. That's March 3rd at 7 p.m. I'm just going to do a quick plug for other library events that are coming up. On Tuesday, February 15th, there's a virtual poetry night where you can either share your own work or listen to other authors in the area. And then on Tuesday, February 22nd, we have a community conversation series with guest speaker Richard Kem. It will be centered around courageous conversations and how to engage in difficult discussions with friends and family on topics of systematic oppression. You can learn about these events and other things on our website at ncwlibraries.org or by following us on Facebook or Instagram. Thank you so much, everyone, for your time tonight, and hopefully we will see you all next month.
Thanks, everyone. Have a good night. Thanks, Ash.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Bye.